We're going to fly at 34,000 feet tonight, so I'd like you to all fasten your seatbelts. We're looking in these plenary talks at what I'm calling the new religion of self. And I've dubbed this ego-paganism. And in the last talk, last evening, we saw that this qualifies as a religion because in the modern world, the self has assumed attributes that belong to God alone. So here in this talk, we're going to look at how this great God parody works in our times. Now, the first thing we need to see is that ego-paganism works in the myth of self-creation. This is the central commitment of ego-paganism. Ego-paganism works in the myth of self-creation. This is its central commitment. So yesterday we considered briefly the former iteration of paganism, nature paganism. And here's a paganism that also worked within myths and stories which were centered round the gods. So you think of the classical Greek gods, Zeus, Apollo, and Mars. The myths were around these stories. Now, ego-paganism has its own myth. And this myth is the story of how everyone is self-creating. So when we ask the timeless question, who am I? The answer today is remarkably straightforward. I am who I want to be. That's my story. So who I am is who I've created myself to become. So the modern self today functions in the belief that we have the power to determine our own existence. We have the power to determine our own identity through an act of self-creation. So who we are is entirely up to us. We are the source of our own being. Now we're going to come back to this later in this talk. To believe this and to act on this principle that we can self-create is to play God, because it assumes a divine prerogative, that we are the source of ourselves. Now, it's really important for us to see today that ego-paganism hasn't discarded the notion of God. It's simply relocated divinity so it's now in us. And we use our divine-like power to self-create. So a power and a prerogative that was once attributed to God alone has now been transferred to every individual self. Now, if you look at the West, especially over the last, 100 years, we've had a fascination in Europe and America with the self-made person. So people like Steve Jobs, George Soros, Mark Zuckerberg, Oprah Winfrey, and then this guy, Elon Musk, who I personally find terrifying. So these are people, the self-made people are those who have courageously seized their destiny, climbed to the top, and become billionaires. And by doing this, by becoming self-made, they defined who they were. They defined their identity. And we love these kind of characters because they fit the myth of self-creation. They're wonderful representatives of this. Now ego-paganism, in this particular moment, the ego-paganism that's taken over all the West, being self-made isn't just for the Elon Musk, it's for everyone. All of us must be self-made people. And that's because the modern self believes in our power to self-create. So what this means is that everyone is now an entrepreneur of themselves. We're entrepreneurs of ourselves. So we do this by utilizing our internal power to make ourselves. Deep in our internal life, we all have the freedom to create our truest and our best self. That's the myth of self-creation that the ego-pagan lives in. This is the myth that we embrace as truth. And if you challenge this myth today, if you challenge people and say, you can't self-create, it's not possible, you'll be met with a torrent of outrage. There's such a firm commitment to being self-made and self-created. Now, what self-creation means in practice is that everyone has to be an original. That's what self-creation aims for. It's a resolute commitment to individuality. Now, the American academic sociologist Robert Balla calls this expressive individualism. You discover yourself not by looking to key relationships in your life, your family, your friendships, how your society has shaped you. Those are all social constructions that actually oppress you. Who you truly are is within yourself. And if you look within, you'll discover the someone who is utterly unique. And in doing that, you can rise above the crowd. That's the messaging we see everywhere today. You're an original. You're a standout. And it's interesting, many Disney films play on this myth. We parents think a U-rated film is a safe one. Like every Disney film is totally safe. We need to bring a little bit of critical faculty to Disney films. Because one of the great messages of Disney films is, you're an original. So think, for instance, of, it's a few years old now, a Goofy movie. Fairly harmless, you'd say. The lyrics of one of its songs is a very pepful, songful kind of film. One of the verses goes, some people settle for the typical thing, living all their lives waiting in the wings. My singing's not going to get any better than that. And then it goes to chorus, to stand out above the crowd, even if I gotta shout out loud, till mine is the only face you'll see, gonna stand out till you notice me. To be an original. To be a standout. Now, to do that, we today have to push the boundaries of social conventions and norms. If we're going to ensure that we stand out and be utterly unique, we've got to push back on the expectations that society puts on us. We have to break free from them. It's one of the emancipations we have to go through. This reminded me of Oscar Wilde's famous quote, and Oscar Wilde was the master of irony. Don't take this too seriously. Be yourself. Everyone else is already taken. Now, our trying to be original today can take multiple forms. To ensure self-creation is on our terms. We might today challenge social expectations around beauty. There's a place for this. So the fashion industry says size 0 is beautiful. And someone says, no, it's not. I'm going to push back on that expectation. Big is beautiful. It's a way we try to be original. And then, of course, we have lots of pushing back on social expectations around gender and sex. And I'm thinking particularly here of the trans movement. Here we're told that maleness and femaleness is a social construct that oppresses us. So I'm going to be original by pushing back on these gender norms. Now, some have genuine trans conflict. I know them. But many of what we might call the Gen Z generation, identify as trans, not because they actually experience gender dysphoria. It's simply a way of expressing their originality. I have a friend who teaches in one of the faculties at Cambridge University, and he said the first year intake, last year, half of his class were trans. That's how they express their individuality, their originality, how they were going to stand out and push back on social expectations. Now, in terms of how ego-paganism works, we need to see it's a commitment that comes down to my will to be me. So it's up to me as the individual to determine by my will who I'm going to become. Now, this will to be me has a very long history. I think we can trace it back to last century and the thought of Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche was adamant that everyone has the power to shape the reality of who they are by an act of their will. And Nietzsche believed we needed to harness the power of our world to shape ourselves. Who we are is who we will ourselves to be. And to do that, he says, requires courage and lots of inner strength. And actually, Nietzsche was calling for a reset on Western civilization. He said we have to go back to the world of the classical, of the ancient Greeks. To be Uberman, the will to be me, we have to bypass Christianity because Christianity is weakness. Jesus wasn't Alexander the Great, who thought raw power is what leadership was about. Jesus said strength is shown in weakness, in service, in sacrifice. Nietzsche said there's no way that we can will to be ourselves if we're going to follow that ideology. So we have to go back to the Greeks who prized strength. We need to take people like Achilles in Homer's Iliad as our model for the will to be me. Boy, would I give anything to look like him. So, the will to be me is where self-creation lies. And ego-paganism today is very much beginning to draw on this pre-Christian heritage. Today there's no gods but the self, but in this new religious commitment, we have the will to be who we are. So self-creation requires the will to power, cultivating a sense of power from within and actively willing ourselves into existence. So, that's the central commitment of ego-paganism. How does this work? Well, it's a two-step process. And in the remainder of this talk, we're going to examine the first phase in terms of how self-creation works. And it works like this. Everyone has to self-authenticate. Self-authentication is a central creed for the ego-pagan, the first necessary step for creating ourselves. Now, it's interesting, Charles Taylor, the great Canadian philosopher, he labeled our age the age of authenticity. And he asked, what's the ultimate virtue in the age of authenticity? Virtue ethics. Well, the ultimate virtue in the age of authenticity is be true to yourself. Be true to yourself. As Tara Burton puts it in her book, Self-Made, I am the only truth I know. There's no higher truth than the one in me. And that's the one I have to be true to. And that's why it's up to everyone now to discover their truest self that requires authenticating. We have to find the self that we really are. So, how do we self-authenticate? Well, there are several things that need to be in place as a prerequisite to self-authentication. 3. First, we need to have faith in ourself. The ego-pagan has moved from in God is my faith to in myself is my faith. And faith here works, as it does in Scripture, as a synonym for trust. Trust is where you put your highest confidence in the face of limits. And today, this confidence and trust is focused to the self. So I'm emphasizing the faith element here because I'm really playing on this fact that ego-paganism is a religion. John Calvin said, the seed of religion is in every heart. It's going to be worked out somehow. Here's how we work it out today. In this high-level trust that we put in the self. We put on the self ultimate value. The self has value, huge value, but not ultimate value. Our faith gives it ultimate value, and that's why we have to be true to ourselves. The second prerequisite, something that needs to be in place before we self-authenticate, is self-love. We can only be true to ourselves if we learn to love ourselves. Now, there's some truths here. In fact, every lie is a half-truth. So we can pick out some half-truths from this, but this is a real problem. So the commandment we live by today is love the Lord yourself with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind. Kamal Ravikant wrote a book, a bestseller, entitled Love Yourself Like Your Life Depends on It. And he tells us how he reached the bottom in terms of his own life. He was too depressed to get out of bed, and one day he hit what he calls his emotional threshold. And that's when he took steps to love himself. Listen to him. This day, he said, it was a vow, a religious vow. This day, he wrote it down on a piece of paper. I vow to myself to love myself, to treat myself as someone I love truly and deeply in my thoughts, my actions, the choices I make, the experiences I have. Each moment I am conscious, I make the decision, I love myself. He then writes, the journey to self-love is a profound act of self-empowerment. By embracing our inherent worth and nurturing a compassionate relationship with ourselves, we unlock boundless possibilities for growth and fulfillment. Self-love is key to how we self-authenticate. Now, it's really interesting. Theologians, in understanding the doctrine of God, talk about God's own self-love. And actually, they talk about this as a property of his divine being. God loves himself. Why? Is he a narcissist? No, he loves himself because he's the supreme good. There's nothing higher or greater to love. And that's why his self-love isn't narcissistic. Well, in the age of the ego-pagan, self-love is something everyone must have because there's no higher good to love than yourself. Then the third thing that we need before we can self-authenticate is that we have to become a law unto ourselves. These are all religious categories. Faith, love, self-love, and then becoming a law unto ourselves. So, because it's up to me to determine who I am, I have to be the highest authority I live by. My moral compass must be determined by me. So what's written in us is more authoritative than what's outside of us, what society says, what the law of God says. So if we're going to be true to ourselves, we have to become the masters of our own universe. Because only then can we shape who we are on our terms. Now, every religion has to define moral good. It's essential to religion, to every worldview. The norms and standards we live by. For Christians, clearly God is the author of all things, and he's the authority to prescribe the norms, what we must live by, on the basis of his own character. Well, the ego-pagan today gives the self that authority. Every individual is a law unto themselves, and this is what they must be true to. It's why Nietzsche said, a little bit cryptically, I shall be ruling the world from now on. He's a law to himself. Now, we see this worked out in lots of ways in our culture today. We see it in the sexual revolution. It goes back to the 1960s. There we had to unshackle ourselves from the sexual norms of middle-class society and the church. So this was a move towards everybody being a law unto themselves in terms of sexual preference. The high priest of this movement is Foucault, the French philosopher. His history of sex is so seminal in this movement, in the sexual revolution. And it's interesting, he defines sex for the first time as orientation. Every individual has their own sexual profile, and that must be given precedence in terms of how we work it out. Well, that means because we're a law unto ourselves, we get to determine how we practice sex. That's our decision. And woe betide any person who challenges that. Poor J.K. Rowling. I mean, she's not poor. She's actually very rich. But she simply made a comment about the Woman's Monthly and is still canceled by huge sections of the literary establishment. She questioned this part of the sexual revolution. We're a law unto ourselves. She actually went back to various norms that are biological. We also see us being a law unto ourselves in terms of how we do the truth. I mentioned this last night. Being a law unto ourselves means that everyone gets to determine what's true. So this is an incredible new power for ego-pagans. Every individual has a self-imposed authority to prescribe the truth of the world on our terms. So if you believe in a flat earth, there's probably no flat earthers in Czech, but there's plenty in my country. That's true for you. And if you want to deny climate change, or if you want to say we're living at 1 minute to midnight, well, that's your truth. And who cares about the facts? When we're a law unto ourselves with respect to truth, facts no longer matter. And that's why truth today is a person's personal preference. This is much more authoritative than objective truth. That's just the external world trying to oppress me. This is true. I can verify it. There's an American academic today who wants to prove, so I guess he does believe in proof, that 1 + 1 doesn't equal 2. Why? Because that's an oppressive truth. He calls that white man's math. I call it why I get on an airplane. Because if an aeronautical engineer didn't believe 1 + 1 is 2, I don't think my plane's going to fly. It's a really important fact. But we're told, nope, it's not a fact. I don't have to believe it. So these are the prerequisites for self-authentication. Faith in myself, self-love, and becoming a law unto ourselves. Now, when these are in place, everyone's free to be true to themselves. So how does this work? Well, self-authentication is the journey of discovery about who I want to be. And all of this is embedded in my internal life, in your internal life. So deep inside all of us are the special attributes of our unique self. And if we look inward and discern these, we can shape ourselves on our terms and be true to it. Now, I don't think anyone can avoid this conclusion. Being true to our internal life means being true to our experiences, being true to our emotions, and ultimately being true to our desires. Because so much of our internal life is desire, which is good because God put it there. But we mustn't think that that's what we ultimately need to be true to. So the self-creation of the ego-pagan, authenticating ourselves, is being true to the image of our desire. Rather than being true to the image of God, we reflect another, and in knowing Him, we come to see who we are. We say, no, it's our desires which fashion us. We are made in the image of our internal desires. And that's why we have to follow our desires, our internal life, so we can be our authentic selves. Now, this interiority that I'm describing here is something now that has a sacred quality bestowed on it. And that's why it qualifies, I believe, as the new paganism. Yesterday I said nature paganism conferred something sacred on the external worlds. Your spirit animal, the sun, a mountain. Ego-paganism confers something sacred on our internal life. It's what's in us, what we put faith in, what we love, what we treat as the standard of a binding law. And today there are new movements that actually reflect this as a kind of magic. Now, this isn't going to work for you. I've asked a few of you, you're also culturally astute. Have you heard of this movement? The movement called manifestation. I see a nodding head here. A few of you have. It's huge in the United Kingdom. It's massive. It's not fringe. Amongst teenagers and 20-somethings, it's sweeping the Western worlds. Now, manifestation works like this. There are magical forces in your internal worlds. And manifestation says if you project the magic in you onto the external world and visualize your future, it's going to happen. So dig within, harness the magic, think about the career that you really, really want. I mean, I could do that now. I'd like to be a football player, a professional football player. If I manifest it, it might happen. So it's what happens when you merge the magic of your internal desire with the cosmic energy in the universe. Then your dreams come true. Look it up online. Manifestation. And if you don't have a really good computer chip, it's going to blow up. It's huge. Now, what's really interesting about manifestation is that it's all about unlocking our fullest potential. And this really gets to the goal of self-authentication. Self-authentication is about the perfecting of ourselves. Everyone has the inner power to become the best version of themselves. You hear this all the time. Be the best version of yourself. And this can happen on the basis of the three prerequisites we've just looked at. Now, this actually echoes an ancient heresy, a heresy in the early church known as Pelagianism. This was rooted in the teaching of Pelagius. He was an early church theologian. And he thought individuals possessed the ability to achieve perfection in their relationship with God that didn't necessarily have to go through the cross of Jesus. We have internally the conditions to make ourselves right with God, to perfect ourselves before Him. Well, today's ego-paganism has a very similar kind of heresy going on, that we internally have what it takes to perfect ourselves, something that we can be true to. Okay, let's ask some questions of all of this. Can we self-create? Can we be true to ourselves? Can we believe in ourselves? This idea of in myself is my faith. Does this work? Well, not according to G.K. Chesterton, his wonderful book, Orthodoxy. And his classic line, the men or the people who really believe in themselves are all in lunatic asylums. It's interesting, this book's old now, but he was already beginning to pick up on something here. Trying to self-create by being true to ourselves, by self-authenticating, is the way of madness. Because no matter how hard we try, we simply can't achieve it. Now, if we want evidence as to why it's not working, it's all around us. I mentioned one of these evidences for us last evening. We're locked today in the biggest identity crisis in history. So this is the great irony of our times. Look, if you're interested in culture, look for ironies. Ironies tell you so much about what's going on. Here's a big one. Everyone's self-creating. We're obsessed with making our identity, but despite all the effort, we're in this massive identity crisis. The modern self really doesn't look very stable. Our identities that we create seem so fluid, transient, moving from one thing to the other. Doesn't look like it's working. The other thing you see, this is with the idea of being original. You look at the city streets, and maybe my eyesight is just deteriorating because I'm almost 60, but I look and I think everyone looks the same. Everyone's trying to be original, but everyone looks the same. So here we are in the age of authenticity, being unique, standing out, and yet we're flattened into sameness. Now, I mentioned this German philosopher I love, Byung-Chul Han, his book, Agony of Eros. And he says the modern self, because we've lost a sense of other, doesn't have, we talked about this yesterday, negativity. The other is negativity. I am not you, and I'm not you. That negativity, he says, is essential for distinction. But the loss of negativity means everything is flattened into sameness. What I called yesterday the self-inferno. Now, you've seen the sameness in consumer culture. There's so many brands, so many clothing fashions, so many cosmetics, so many different types of car. And they're all sold with the promise of helping you become the real you. Wear these running shoes, drive this car, that'll authenticate you. But everyone else is wearing the same shoes and driving the same car. And if you follow a YouTube influencer, they're the prophets and prophetesses of how to self-create. They tell you what to buy to become your unique self. They get paid a lot of money to do it. Don't forget that. But your influencer has millions of other followers. No wonder we look the same. C.S. Lewis was onto this long ago. He said, aiming for originality is a fool's errand. The more novel we try to be, the more a parody of ourselves we become. He says if you don't aim for uniqueness, if you don't aim for originality, you might get there. But to try and be original never works. So, let's change up our focus here. Let's think about how Christianity challenges the myth of self-creation. And here I want to focus very much on a doctrine of God. The doctrine of God, which is central to Christianity. This is where my emphasis is. My talks here aren't so much about our apologetic engagement. That's a really important subject. But what we're doing here is more for us. How can we be convinced that self-creation is a myth? How can we be convinced and not beguiled by this? So, we need to be clear on how God shows up self-creation as a myth. And what theology teaches us about God, what the Bible teaches us about God, is that only God is the source of his own being. Only God is the source of his own being. And this truth is enshrined in a doctrine known as divine aseity. Before 2 of my kids turned 5, they asked me the aseity question. Daddy, who made me? God did, darling. Oh. Daddy, who made the world? God did, darling. He's the creator. Oh. Daddy, who made God? No one did. What? You can't be serious. Yeah. No one made him. He's the uncreated being. That's divine aseity. God is the source of his own existence. That means he's uncaused and uncreated. In Exodus 3, we see Moses getting a desert tutorial on aseity. He spots a bush on fire off in the distance. He goes a bit nearer to look, and it's not burning up. The bush isn't consumed. He thinks, do I have sunstroke? I've been out with my goats all day. Did I take my medication this morning? What's going on here? So he approaches the bush, and he hears a voice from within the bush. This is a conversation between Yahweh and a human person. And in that exchange, God tells Moses his name. I am that I am, or I will be what I will be, or I was what I was. This term is so rich, this name, but it reflects at the very least divine aseity. God is the one who is, who was, and who shall be. And like the bush, he is not consumed. God is the great inconsumable. And he's that because he's the source of his own being. He has aseity. And that's what assures, guarantees the self-sufficiency of God. God is the only one who relies on nothing beyond his Trinitarian existence for who he is. He lives in perfect comfort, perfect satisfaction as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and he doesn't need anything beyond that. He didn't create because he was having a bad day. It was the superfluity of his love. That's why he created. And all this makes God independent. And no wonder God tells Moses to take off his sandals, to get the Nike sneakers off his feet. It's a reminder to Moses to get back to where he came from. You came from the dust. That is your source. I have no source. I'm the inconsumable. So here's the reminder that humans are not self-sufficient. Only God is self-sufficient. And God is independent because of his own being. We are dependent. And we only exist because we've been created by him. He is our source. And we image him, which means we only find him, or find ourselves as we find him. So this is the fundamental truth about every human. We're not self-created, we're God-created. And that makes us totally depend on him for who we are. This is really the truth. This is reflected beautifully in one of my favorite psalms. The psalmist says, "For you created my inmost being," which is absolutely wonderful, our interior life. You created that too. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in the secret place, and when I was woven together in the depths of the earth. A beautiful poetic expression of our creation, how God forms us. So, because God is the source of himself, he is the only one and true authentic one. So God has the kind of being, the kind of existence that enables him to be true to himself. Now, this is reflected in another doctrine of God, which is known as divine simplicity. It's simply a way of saying God isn't a composite being, which is pieced together from his individual attributes, like a puzzle where all the pieces make up the picture. That's not who God is. No, in God, all his attributes are one, as God himself is one. So when we speak about God's love, we're also referring to his power, to his goodness, to his wisdom, to his justice, to all his other attributes. Augustine said, the attributes of God are the diamond God has given us to view him in our limited way, but he's one, and all his attributes are one. This is known as divine simplicity. It simply means that God is what he possesses. So that means God's essence, who he fundamentally is in his oneness, and God's attributes or qualities, these are inseparable. So think for a moment about the goodness of God. This isn't a virtue that God acquired. God didn't become good because day by day by day he kept practicing goodness, and then finally he became a good person. No, God is good. That's his ontology. That defines his very nature and essence. So what this means is that God has no potential to be realized. God is who he is to perfection. So every aspect of God's nature is fully present and totally complete. God never has a bad day. He's always true to himself and could never be otherwise. And God is who he is effortlessly and authentically. No exhaustion in God trying to be himself. He just is himself because of who he is. He's at total peace with who he is in his Trinitarian existence. Now, as humans, we have a very different kind of nature. And that means we can't authenticate in the same way God does. So firstly, we don't have a satiety. We're not the source of our own being. We're created. We're dependent. We need other to become who we are. And as human creatures, we're not the same. What we are is not the same as our potential. Humans have become more in terms of their virtue. They can become less. Even in terms of our inherent giftedness, we can grow in them or we can decline in them. Michael Jordan, I've just watched The Last Dance. Wow. He was made with spectacular athletic potential. But this had to be realized in Jordan. He had to work hard at it, to mature into it. He didn't achieve his basketball genius without effort. That's not how it is with God. It's effortless because of who he is. Now there's another reason, a theological reason why humans couldn't possibly be true to themselves. And this goes with the doctrine of the fall, Genesis 3. Not only do we have a nature that's not fixed in our createdness, we're also corrupted and fallen. The doctrine of sin highlights the impossibility of being true to ourselves. The human heart is divided, the Bible says. Solzhenitsyn describes it perfectly. The battle line between good and evil runs right through the heart of every person. Now that's hard to be true to, because we're so divided. Internally, there's something compromised about us, corrupted. This is Immanuel Kant's the warp of timber, the warp timber of humanity, he called it. So that means there's not enough moral stability in the internal life of humans to be true to. Paul makes his argument in Romans 2. He said, we don't even live up to our own standards. We can't be true to the standards we set to ourselves, which is why God can judge those who've never heard the law. We can't even live up to that. Now that's in total contrast to God's pure and holy nature, which is the guarantee that he'll always be faithful to who he is. Now the Christian is someone who acknowledges this. This is just nice theology. This is actually fundamental to how we understand God and how we understand ourselves. He is our creator and source. We are dependent on him. He's also our Redeemer in the person of Jesus Christ. And we need to be redeemed because we're not true to ourselves. We're corrupt and incapable of self-authenticating in the way that ego-pagans say we can. So we have very good reason, that's my argument, in our faith to demolish the central commitments of ego-paganism. First, that we can self-create, and then secondly, that we can be true to ourselves. So I said yesterday, we need to recover the greatness of God, to demolish this idolatry. And here's part of God's greatness: his aseity, the simplicity of his nature, his oneness, which means he can only be true to himself. We need these insights into God to help us demolish this religion, which I'm saying is the greatest idolatry we've ever faced.